Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And we're going to be talking about the strikes taking place. Where are they taking place? Who is striking? Are some of the questions we are going to answer. Please leave a like and super chat and hit that join button to become a member. And I'm here with a guy who is going to tell us all about this. Former Marxist turned free market, individual rights person, intellectual, Nikos Sotirakopoulos.
Thank you. The title is misleading because I won't be making the case against the strikes. We're just trying to figure out if strikes are compatible with the right to respect in society, and also if strikes are a good idea for workers to defend their rights. So,
well, we might actually change the title after the fact. So by the time someone watches this discussion, they might be confused. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
The current title is The Case Against the Strikes or something like that. So it's just going to make the case that these particular strikes, but you'll see what they'll say. Anyway, so you said that I was a Marxist. Not only I was a Marxist, I was part of picket lines. So my first experience with strikes was waking up at 4 a.m. and at 5:30 being at places where there was a strike, normally a big factory, or there weren't that many in Athens, like a big supermarket or a hotel. And the idea was that the striking workers stay in front and they either humiliate verbally or actually don't allow people who don't want to strike to work. So the idea is that we are on strike and therefore no one works. And this was also the history of the strikes in the United Kingdom. So particularly in the late 70s, but also in the 80s, in the UK, there were strikes that were at a scale that you could actually call them low-level civil war. Now, you will see many things in the news these days about strikes, and these strikes these days are an inconvenience, but let's keep this historical perspective that the labor movement has been clearly defeated, more or less. So these strikes are just a glimpse of what the country had to face back in the day with strikes. So let me give you a simple example. This winter and these days, we have the strikes from railroad workers, from nurses, from teachers, driving examiners, bus drivers, and even ambulances. And we can discuss whether ambulances should even have the right to strike. And you could think, oh my God, all these people are striking. This is unprecedented. But actually, it's not. So even if the strikes this year reach the peak that we might think that there's a prediction that they will peak, they will cost something like 1 million working hours. This is how you measure strike activity. You add up all the hours of all the workers who are on strike, and you see how many working hours were lost. So this year, there might be a possibility that we will get to 1 million hours. Now, this might sound a lot. But here's the thing. In the 80s, in the UK, through the miners' strike, we had the loss of 26 million working hours. This was the confrontation of the Margaret Thatcher government with the coal miners' unions. And if we go further back, in 1979, we had 29 million working hours being lost in a year. So today, this year, it's going to be something like 30 times smaller. So that's one big difference, that strikes back in the day were almost actually a colossal political conflict. There was violence and there were mass number of people participating in them. So why don't we have these big strikes anymore? For two reasons. The one is that there was a various pieces of legislation that passed under the Margaret Thatcher government, which said that if you want to strike, you strike, but you cannot either stop your employer from hiring at least a small number of people who should be able to work. And also that if you strike, you cannot hold the picket line by bringing people from other trade unions. Now, I'm simplifying this. So back in the day, the coal miners would have a strike and the whole of the trade union movement in the UK would support them. So strikes at least as they happen in countries where they're heavily under the auspices of the law, like in the UK, it's mostly an issue of using force and also using the force that the law gives you. The idea that says that if I go on strike, no one is allowed to work. Now, this hasn't been the case, or it hasn't been the case that much. This is why we see less and less strikes. So this is to give the big picture. So the big picture is this week, it might be annoying. We could even say this is not how things should be, but let's keep into perspective that what we see as strike activity these days, it has nothing to do with what used to be the case. Now, this has nothing to do with our moral evaluation of a strike. I'm just putting this on the table so that we know what we're talking about. So shall we then go and talk about the principle behind any strike, or have you got anything to say up to this point?
Why did you say there are less and less strikes now?
So one, because there's a legislation which is which is curtailing your ability not to strike for yourself, but it curtails your ability to force other people to strike with you or to bring, let's say, reinforcements in the picket line as it used to be back then. But the other main reason is because there is no serious trade union movement these days. And most people will say this was because of evil Margaret Thatcher, that she passed these legislations and she destroyed the unions. But actually, Thatcher has been out of office since how many? Almost 30 years. And yet we still see there is not much, resurrection of the trade unions. And the main reason is because trade unions are not these voluntary associations where people can come together and go after their interests. They've mostly been, in a way, nationalized. So there are these official bodies with this huge bureaucracy. Even when there is a strike, there are, there are very particular rules, bureaucratic rules. You have to name it an official, quote, industrial dispute. So it's completely different from what you might have in mind, where workers suddenly say, that's enough, we are striking, join us, and they shout hurrah, and they take over the factory. So this is perhaps the biggest legacy of the change in the Labour Party, that now trade unions are mostly these middle-class, huge bureaucratic institutions that are more like a lobby group rather than these grassroots movements that express the actual needs of the workers and of the employees.
Right on. Okay, well, we can talk about the principles now that we've covered the concretes.
And one more for the concretes. If you want to understand what really meant that, what I said, that strikes were a low-level civil war, what's a very beautiful movie called Billy Elliot. This is a musical. This is not a political film, but the background of the film is the miners' strike of, I think, 1984. So check out Billy Elliot. It's a beautiful musical. The music is brilliant. I would say even there's some quasi-objectivist themes on how a young, bright kid wants to follow its dreams. But you see what really meant a society being so polarized as it was at the time of the miners' strike. Now, the principle behind the strikes. So these particular strikes, the point is that, look, because of inflation, we are getting way less money. And I would say this is actually true. If you're a nurse, or if you're any worker, indeed, due to inflation, you get less. The point is, how would this negotiation look in a free society? And in my view, it would look in a way which would be way, way more beneficial for the worker. So here is the Nikos radical point. The point with the trade unions today and with their strike actions is that they're not good for the workers. And here's why. Let's say you're a very good nurse. You're a very good doctor. Your salary has to be exactly the same with everyone else. That's the first issue. So when you say, I want a fair salary, fair by what standard? I can go to my boss and say, hey, look, I've produced 165 pieces of content this year. therefore give me a rise, because otherwise I will go and work for Cato Institute, whatever. I make a case on why this is fair. How can you make a case for you and 300,000 other people who work with you? That's the first problem. So if you think about it, the principle behind the strike is the principle of altruism. Altruism, the way Rand calls it, that in a way we have to self-sacrifice for the nurses and pay them from our pocket because, again, they're public servants. And every nurse has to, by taking the strike, has to sacrifice and do this collective bargaining where they cannot negotiate one-on-one. Now, there are cases where it makes sense to make a collective bargaining, but all these things should not be at least obligatory. So maybe it makes sense for me and the junior fellows to tell to the Ayn Rand Institute, we want a collective bargaining of how much money we want. But at the same time, it might make sense for me to say, sorry, guys, my needs are different than yours. I'll make my own negotiation. This is practically impossible in the public sector this year. So the two problems are, first of all, how do you signify or how do you make the case of what is a fair salary? It's impossible on a public service. And second, you are tied with hundreds and thousands of other people who at the same time are tied to the taxpayer. So suddenly, this is not a conflict between the nurse and the management. And I'm 100% with the nurse, for the record, in this particular industrial conflict, whatever has to do with the NHS. It is everyone versus everyone else. And the point is who will have the most force to tell to the other side, now you suck it, I've had it my way. Mm-hmm. I think I've spoken for 11 out of these 12 minutes.
Wow.
So I don't want to monopolize this.
No, hey, we like monopolies. I think, we've definitely gotten far from the ideal, far from home when the government is as immersed in the world of unions as it is today. And even government employees have their unions as well. So yeah, unions should never be forced or even incentivized by the government. The government should completely stay out. But if we had to steelman like the case for unions, it would be, of course you can rise by your merit. You can ask for a raise if you can demonstrate that you deserve it, but a certain kind of working environment or a certain minimum wage or a certain maybe cap to how many work hours you can. Let's say, I don't know how you would negotiate this, but let's say the union people, the workers unionize and they say, like, we don't want more than, 50 hours a week. And then the boss says, okay, but what if one employee does want to work longer than that? You're saying I should not do that. And they would say, like, maybe you should be able to but no, you can't. I don't know. Like, there's really no way to negotiate it because they would say, no, it just means you can't fire him if he doesn't want to work more than 50 hours. But it's like, okay, but what are you going to read your boss's mind when he decides who to hire and who to keep employing and who not? It's been said, I think Ayn Rand said this in one of her interviews, that the sort of desire for unions sort of came about when there was corruption between local politicians and business owners. And, mostly when we think about the lobby system and corruption, we mostly think about the federal government, the big business and the big politicians, handing each other millions and millions of dollars and all of us needing to suffer as a result. But I think probably the most corruption is at a local level. Like, government is most, they regulate the most and they're most unreasonable at a very local level. I mean, you have these like losers basically in your local district who they have nothing better to do then run for some bogus board and then just police your restaurant and police your business and just mess with you. And when you have the government, even a local government in this instance, regulating and taxing and doing all of these things, you're going to start to see relationships between businesses and government. So even going back to the 19th century, to the extent that type of thing was going on, where you would have the local district selectsman sort of doing a favor for one business to help him, to protect him from competition, the workers end up in a position where they don't have another business to go work for. And they end up in a position where they're being treated unreasonably, or they're being treated in a way, their work environment and work requirements are way worse than they would be if there was a competitive employer across the street. And that gives the desire, that brings up the necessity for workers to unionize, arguably. So in an actual capitalist society where there is no relationship between politicians and businessmen, arguably there never would have been an invention of unions, because workers generally would see with their own observation, there's just so many opportunities that they can definitely pick the best employment for them at that time. And there's really no reason to waste time going on strike, let alone beating up anyone who doesn't join the strike, and all types of shenanigans that have taken place by.
But here's the thing. Why is this violence being accepted? So in the early 90s in Greece, we had a public stripping. So we had some trade unionists, actually not of the Communist Party, of the Communist and of the Socialist Party. So this would be the equivalent of saying of the Democratic Party. So I'm not talking about some freaks. I'm talking about rank and file trade unions who later would become mostly members of parliament and stuff. They would proceed in actions that were so disgusting, such as stripping someone naked because they accepted a new deal by the government against the line of the strike. Why is the only reason that the public goes for that? This philosophy which says, look, you have to suffer for your brother. If everyone is not happy with the new deal, no one should take the new deal. If everyone is not happy, if not every single striker is not happy, then no one should take a deal which is beneficial for themselves. So that particular conflict, it was the government would give bus drivers the opportunity to buy the public buses, so to speak, and run it as a quasi-private enterprise. And many bus drivers said that's a great idea. But here's the thing. Here's how collectivism is a bitch. Then the point was, tough luck. You think this is a good idea for you. But I see here in the ballot that 63% voted and said this is not a good idea. Therefore, you cannot do what you want. Not only you are not legally able to do, even worse, you are not morally allowed to. Therefore, even if you are the victim of beatings or of publicly stripping you in the most central square in Athens, which is exactly what happened back then, people would say, well, they had it coming. So here's another thing at the same time. How does a country do? How do the workers in the country do where there are very, very strong trade union laws, and when trade unions have too much power to use coercion vis-a-vis the bosses? We can take again the example of Greece. Someone would think there's this misconception that says that without strong trade unions, there is no workers' progress. And on the opposite, with the more trade unions you have, the strongest the trade union participation and the strongest the protection of trade union, the strongest will be the benefits for the workers. Again, the example here is Greece, and we saw the exact opposite. There was for some years a false sense that the workers were doing fine. Of course, all these were money out of debt or out of heavy taxation or out of unsustainable debt. And what happens then? The economy collapses, and these very same workers say, oh, we've been bamboozled. You promised me a high pension. You promised me that I would have this job forever. And now we see that my factory doesn't exist anymore. So if we see the things long term, we see that trade unions whose only weapon is not how good their workers are or how indispensable their workers are, but whose main bargaining power is force, sooner or later, and within a generation, I'm not talking within 300 years, within a generation, they see that now they're way, way worse off. And one last thing. Why do we have this inflation these days? Mostly because of the lockdowns and the state creating money out of thin air. What was the position of the unions during the COVID pandemic? Protect the workers, Don't let them go back to work without every guarantee possible. And at the same time, give us furlough money. Where would that money come from? I don't care. 1 year down the road, high inflation. 1.5 years down the road, the inflation is so high that now they have to go on strike because, and they're right, their previous salary now actually can buy them way more. So reality bites back. And I'm saying this with not triumphantly. I'm saying this with sorrow, because most of these people, they work hard, they deserve way much better than what this system is giving them.
Yeah. Okay. Super chat from Marilyn with $2. She says, I like the legislation Nikos described. It's just. So that's like the right to work type of legislation that like doesn't let the union block you from working. Is that basically it?
It is basically it. So if for people who want to see more, you can go to 9080 employment law in the UK. Now, this is far from ideal, because the way I evaluate Margaret Thatcher's reforms was that also in a way she nationalized trade unions. So that's not a solution for it, but it's better than what used to be, which is that trade unions would keep the whole of the British society hostile. And here is where my sympathy to the worker stops. When a politician tells you, look, you work for a public entity, let's say the public coal mines, it's running at a loss. I'm not going to shut you down, but do you agree to become shareholders? So you're not going to be paid by the state. I'm literally giving you, I'm handling you the coal mine. Do you want it? Of course, then the trade unionists will say no. Because what they mean fair share is take from someone else and give it to me. So that's where my sympathy would stop from someone. So first of all, when someone is striking and is a state employee, again, it's impossible to say if this is a fair strike. And on the other hand, the only solution would be, okay, do you want to run this by yourself? But now it's not anymore a state monopoly and there's nothing to protect you from competition. And then they say, no, I'm not stupid. So you see, that's why I'm way more disillusioned about strikes than I used to be, even in my early libertarian years, where I thought, okay, trade unions, voluntary association, nothing wrong with it, which in principle it's true, but if you scratch under the surface, it almost never works like that.
Yeah, and the impediments or the lack of capitalism, they bring down our work opportunities and they hurt everybody. So you end up in a position where you feel economically insecure a lot of the time. I just wish more people understood that capitalism is the solution, and a lot of these problems came from the lack of capitalism.
Let me ask you one last question, though, a difficult one.
Uh-oh.
Should the security forces be able to strike? So there's a lot of discussion these days because the Tories want to pass a new legislation that says that for some services that are very crucial, like ambulance drivers or hospitals, there needs to be a minimum of staff even when there's a strike. Now, the ambulance drivers...
Oh, okay.
Let me say one more thing so that people have a clear image. So the ambulance staff, they say that even when there's a strike, if you call them and you say, I'm dying, they will come for you. But I take this a step further. Should there be some particular parts of society, particular professions, that strike should not be an option, should literally be illegal?
I'll answer that. Producer Daniel, what's our super chat total currently? Message me or message us or me in the on the Zoom call. We're at £13.50 pounds. If we get to 20 pounds, only 650 pounds to go. If we get to 20, I'll answer your question. Ooh, there's a challenge.
I thought you'd say something like, I'm not gonna go on strike.
All right, Marilyn with $3 more. Thank you. Thank you, Robert and Equal to Reality for the super chats. Marilyn says, unions encourage stagnation, not merit. Yeah, there is this divine right of stagnation that we keep seeing from the kind of blue collar sort of segment of society. And again, the position they're in would be a lot better in a healthier, rational capitalist society. So a lot of the, a lot of their problems and a lot of their feelings of helplessness come from actual corruption, come from actual violations of property rights at all levels. So it's not their fault, but I wish they all understood that the way out of this is capitalism, individual rights, to celebrate big business and small business, and not to continue asking the government to fix this by violating rights further. So yeah, but this divine right of stagnation, right? Like we see a lot of this, especially on the populist side of the political aisle spectrum, like just like, I'm entitled to my job, I'm entitled to work in the same factory as my parents and their parents. It's like, no. Sometimes, a lot of the times, unions, they destroy jobs and they make jobs go out of existence. Yes, that is true. And sometimes it's foreign competition. Sometimes it's new sectors of the economy. The fact that the internet created all these new technologies put a lot of other technologies out of business. So, or whatever it was, cassette tapes. If you worked at a cassette tape factory, at some point your job stopped existing and you can look for a new job. And at some point there's no need to produce any type of physical object that plays music. So you can't even, you go to work at the CD factory or the disc factory, as I'm guessing you folks call it. But sooner or later, it's all online, it's all digital, and you just gotta, keep. So in any case, your best bet is capitalism, not to demand that you have the right to stagnate.
One more example of not of stagnation, as you said, but also of sacrifice. That we have to sacrifice for the others, and therefore we accept the trade unions' blackmails. The taxi drivers' trade unions in Greece, their line was, the leader of the union, who was a conservative, by the way, he said something like, if I see anyone driving Uber, they're going to be lynched in the most central square of Athens. And instead of a police officer going there and saying, you are arrested for actually inciting violence, the government banned Uber indeed. So Uber would be so useful, but we have to live without it. Why? Because the rights of the trade union is somehow more sacred than mine. And because my hands are tied from saying, the hell with you, Uber will make my life better and also will make the life better of all the Uber drivers. But no, again, collectivism and altruism is a bitch. It tells you, suck it up and suffer for others. And they're using it as a weapon against us.
Marilyn with $5 says, unions are fine as long as government doesn't give them any power. Businesses should not be forced to bargain with them. The better workers lose.
Yeah, remember the union in the Rearden Metal Union, where the union guy is considered, quote, a slave driver, and he has actually guaranteed the best salaries for his workers, and also he has guaranteed to Rearden that he'll bring the best workers. So a union makes sense. It's better both for a union that works in a good way is good both for the workers and for the enterprise.
And Marilyn with $4 more. Thank you for that. I like the union worker or the union boss in Atlas Shrugged, Fred Thompson. No, not Thompson.
Fred Keenan. That's Fred a different Keenan. One from the
Thompson is the president or the head of state, as he's called. Fred Keenan. He's like, obviously one of the thugs in power, but like he kind of calls out the others and he says, I didn't go to college, so I'm not as like delusional as the rest of you. Or I don't understand what the rest of you are talking about a lot of the time, but I'm in charge, he says. I did not ask for this. My workers did not ask for this, but now me and Wesley Mouch are going to make all the decisions and you're all going to go with it, or I take my workers and we leave. So it was a cool
he says
thing.
One thing, I have the numbers, he says to these people. I've got the votes.
Yeah. All right. Well, we did not reach 20 pounds in the super chat, so I'm afraid I cannot answer your question, which is, should some types of workers not be able to strike?
And my answer is clearly yes, they shouldn't be able to strike.
coming up at 7 p.m. UK time, it's the Fountainhead Book Club with Shoshana Milgram for ARCUK members. The session will also be live streamed for YouTube members. Link in the chat. Then tomorrow at 4 p.m. UK time, it's Keeping It Real with James Valiant and Robert Naser. The title is Let's Make Love. Watch at your own risk. Guitar Channel sent over $5 Australian. I don't know if that's enough to get us much closer to the goal.
That's clearly enough. So should
is it? Hold on. First off, let me read his super chat. Second, we can. Okay, Daniel says we reached the goal. Do not assume that an Australian dollar is worth that much. No offense. He says, my boss told me in the 90s when unions shut down the construction industry, he got in heaps of violent altercations just to go to work. Unbelievably unconscionable, and it's glorified and it's romanticized. You ever see the American film The Newsies? You ever see that one? Oh, as a old school Marxist and a political animal, you got to see The Newsies. It's at the turn of the century or so. A bunch of newspaper boys, they all strike and they get into fights with everyone. But they basically physically compel one another to all strike together. And, of course, they're the good guys. The movie makes them look like the heroes. And you even see Teddy Roosevelt, who's like the governor at the time or something, kind of high-fiving them at the end or whatever. He's like the cool, guy who one day will be president and completely ruin America.
The cool uncle.
Anyway. He's the cool one. Yeah. So anyway, so the question was, what? Ask the question again.
Should some particular services like the army be barred from striking?
I don't know. All right. And
but here's the thing. When you join the army, there should be a contract that says, hey, you know what? We cannot afford you to strike. And by the way, I think this should also be the case with the ambulances. And again, if you don't want to, you can do something else. There are many other professions. The moment you sign, we're talking about services that are run by the state. In the private sector, if you have a hospital which says, hey, our workers can strike, more power to you. Just let me know. So when I'm about to sign up with you, I'll keep this in mind.
Right. Yeah. So like a hospital might tell the ambulance driver, the minute you strike, you're fired. I don't care what you heard. You are if that's the agreement, then of course that's fine. Yeah. But yeah, answering question, what should the contract say when you join the military? I'm proud to say I don't know. I'm proud.
But the military, though, is a legitimate, in my view.
Yes, it is. I'm just saying
of the government. So that's why I single it out.
I agree. I'm just making the point here that sometimes not knowing is something to emphasize, because we don't claim to know the application of these principles to every unique case. There is such a thing as legal philosophy and other sub philosophies or specialized philosophies, and these are centuries in the works, folks. Centuries of thinking went into these questions. Daniel with €5 says, are we unfair towards unions? We wouldn't say companies are only okay if government is not involved at all. Well, hold on. So let me answer.
Yeah, go on first. Yeah.
If we were at a point where companies and government were so deeply immersed that you need to clarify that point, then we would say that. And sometimes we do need to say that. Companies are great. I support capitalism, which means the government is not doing favors, not cronyism. So we live in a situation where unions are cronies. So we need to specify what we mean when we say you have a right to unionize, but that's not what we're seeing today. I think that's why we come off as anti-union. You got something to add?
No, that's exactly it. It's so almost everything that the union does is so deep into the frame created by the government that it's very difficult to see them anymore as a voluntary association. The same happens with some companies. For example, with Tesla, we have been quite often, people in the objectivist universe, very critical to it. They even asking, would this company be viable without all this context about the regulations against fossil fuels in favor of electric cars and so on?
We got €11.99 from Marcelina Nahar. That's a beautiful name.
Thank you, Marcelina.
I'm surprised Nikos did not just burst into song. It's I hope that's okay to say in the climate we live in. Marilyn with $5, also a very pretty name, says government employees shouldn't be allowed to unionize.
Shouldn't. I disagree here. I think even the army should be able to have some form of unionization. Now, in Greece, because there's been all these military coups, the army is literally unable to form official unions. But associations to say things like, I don't know, our guns suck, or I wouldn't see necessarily a problem with that, but it's not the hill I'm going to die on.
Yeah, and I mean, we could be wrong about this and that, you know. It's just
but sorry, Rucka, the question though is, who do you unionize against? I think there's a question in one of the novels. So, who, a public sector union, who are you bargaining against? You could say against the government, but at the same time, you are basically bargaining against every single taxpayer, and that's the problem. That when I bargain vis-a-vis my boss, it's like, hey, boss, give me more money, or otherwise I leave. When I bargain with the government, I say, give me Rucka's money.
Yeah, it's look, most government jobs simply should not exist. They should be obsolete because the government only does very specific jobs. So there's only a much smaller number of people that are on the government payroll, and their jobs are very specific. And if, yeah, I mean, maybe let them, quote, the market dictate. I don't know why I'm using scare quotes. Let the market dictate what those jobs pay, meaning how many people are interested in doing that government job and at what price, at what wage, and just see there. Yeah, but I what you're saying makes sense about that you're bargaining with tax dollars. But once again, I'll say, I don't know. I'm not sure. You know, this is a very specialized subject. And sometimes I'm proud to not know. Ignorance can sometimes be celebrated because claiming to know something you don't know is in its own way worse than a lot of things.
I respect this a lot.
Thank you for joining us today. Again, we've got the Fountainhead Book Club coming up at 7 p.m. UK time, and then tomorrow at 4 p.m. UK time, which is earlier than the Daily Objective. It's keeping it real. All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Nikos. Thank you all for the super chats. Wow, we are giving Yaron Brook, reason to sweat a bit. I bet he didn't reach 30 pounds or whatever we reached over here. He's on at the same time as us, but I didn't want to mention that, even though people were commenting about it. I saw no reason to give free promotion to the bloody competitor. But now that we're done, hey, get on over there and watch some Yaron Brook for 20 minutes before the Fountainhead Book Club. Thank you all, and goodbye.